Chapter 3. The Long Voyage. James's ship was a small wooden cat named Endeavour. Her flat base was perfect for exploring unknown coastlines, and James thought her the most beautiful ship he'd ever seen. Thanks to his occasional visits home on leave, he now had 3 children to wave him off. Elizabeth, expecting their 4th child, was in tears as they said goodbye. "Don't worry about me," James reassured her. "They're sending a troop of soldiers along to keep us safe." A royal astronomer went with him to supervise the actual measuring, as well as 2 botanists, Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander, who were going to record all the new plants and animals encountered during the trip. As the crew loaded the ship with food, including cackling hens, a messenger handed James a sealed envelope. "These are secret orders from the Admiralty," the man told him. "Only open them when you're safely at sea." Intrigued, James could hardly wait to break the seal. Inside the envelope, he found orders to search for the great southern continent. This mysterious land was supposed to lie in the Pacific, though no one had ever found it. Every country wanted a place they could claim for themselves and then exploit, and imagined it might be like Europe. The Endeavour was barely underway when she was caught in a violent storm in the Bay of Biscay. Waves smashed onto the decks and all the hens were washed overboard. Undaunted, Cook sailed on. As they crossed the equator, the imaginary line dividing the northern hemisphere from the south, a sailor approached James with a grin on his face. "Sir," he declared, "it's a tradition that every man crossing the equator for the first time have to be dunked in the sea." James thought it sounded hideous and offered everyone a drink if they'd let him off. His crew, happy with the bribe, agreed. Having crossed the Atlantic, they landed in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. James was expecting a friendly welcome, but the viceroy who ran the city thought James and his men were British spies. "Who sails thousands of miles to study a planet?" he scoffed. When he heard the ship needed to stock up on supplies, he declared James alone could leave the ship to get them. James tried to explain he needed his men to help him, and some of the crew were thrown in prison. In the end, the viceroy agreed to release them, on condition James left Rio as quickly as possible. From Brazil, the Endeavour sailed around Cape Horn and into the Pacific Ocean. Before them lay the beautiful palm-fringed island of Tahiti. Excited Tahitians scrambled into wooden canoes and sailed over to greet James and his men. "What are they wearing?" sniffed Banks, looking at the Tahitians' simple clothes. "I hope he isn't rude to them," James thought. "They could hurt us if we upset them." He invited the Tahitian chieftains on board his ship, and as a gesture of friendship they exchanged gifts. James produced metal hatchets for the chiefs, who were ecstatic. Metal was non-existent on Tahiti, so it was extremely valuable. To thank James for his friendship and generosity, the Tahitians agreed to let the royal astronomer set up his telescope on their land. On a bright, clear day, he measured the transit of Venus and completed his mission for the Royal Society. But James knew that the most difficult task still lay ahead of them, the search for the elusive Great Southern Continent. Chapter 4. Uncharted Waters. James's men were reluctant to leave Tahiti. Many had fallen in love with local women and asked if they could stay behind. "You're sailors in the Royal Navy," James told them angrily. "Get back aboard the ship right now." Grumbling, the men obeyed. James headed south, stopping off at dazzling islands along the way to explore and meet the islanders. Everywhere they went, Banks kept a note of the unusual creatures they saw. "Look at that," he said, when he spotted a funny black and white bird waddling across a rock. "I can't wait to tell everyone at home about this." They probably won't believe you, James commented with a grin. Some of these animals are so strange, people will think you're making them up. As the weeks passed, they found plenty of new and fascinating plants and animals, but they didn't find anything that looked like the great southern continent. James decided to change direction, and soon afterwards a lookout spotted a great mass of land. "That's it!" Banks cried in excitement. "We found it!" "I'm not so sure," James replied doubtfully. He was right. Instead of the great southern continent, they had found New Zealand, and a Dutchman, Abel Tasman, had been there already, although he hadn't realised how big it was. Some of the island's inhabitants, the Maoris, spotted James's ship. To them, the Endeavour looked like a huge bird, its white sails flapping in the breeze like wings. Fearing the sailors on board had come to conquer the land and kill all their people, the Maoris attacked. Instantly, the sailors fired into the Maoris' advancing ranks. The Maoris, who had never seen a gun before, were amazed and then appalled when some of their men dropped dead. But the guns won't stop them forever, thought James. Besides, we have to avoid more bloodshed. He didn't want to kill the Maoris, who after all were only protecting their land. "Hold your fire!" James directed his crew sternly. "I want you to take some of their young men hostage instead." The sailors did as they were told, expecting James to threaten the hostages to force the other Maoris to behave. They were astonished when James simply gave the young men gifts, then released them again. "He's asking for trouble," they muttered, but James knew what he was doing. When the hostages returned to their people, they described how well James had treated them. The Maoris quickly realised that the strangers didn't mean them any harm, and from then on, James and his crew traded with them in peace. After drawing the first ever complete map of New Zealand, which turned out to consist of 2 huge islands, James decided it was time to begin the long journey back to England. He and his men had been at sea for nearly 2 years, and they were desperate to see their homes and families again. Of course, James still hadn't found the great southern continent, but by now he was fairly sure that it didn't exist. Wanting to do as much exploring as possible, he decided to take a different route home, along the coast of a vast country named New Holland, and now known as Australia. James sailed along the east coast of New Holland, the first European to see it. He drew detailed maps of every stage, naming each place after his crew or important people back in England. Eventually they came to an area of sea filled with islands and sandbanks. Suddenly James heard a loud grating noise and the whole ship juddered. Some of the men shouted in panic. James felt his own heart race. They'd hit disaster. The bottom of the ship had struck a coral reef.